Hello everyone, my name is Tina Kimsey and today I'd like to give my presentation on interactive read-alouds in the special education setting. So I attended the University of San Diego as an undergraduate, and when I was there my concentration was actually in literature. And I've always found such joy in opening up a good book and immersing myself into the story. So now that I'm finishing my Master's of Education in Curriculum and Instruction at USD, I would really like to share with everyone the work that I've been doing to help instill that same sense of joy with the students that I work with. In the past, I have researched the benefits of using picture books in literature instruction, but I really wanted to dive deeper into a specific read-aloud strategy. So my study was action research, and the question that drove it is, what is the impact on reading engagement and achievement when utilizing interactive read-alouds for special education students at an elementary school in Southern California? And then I had a subsequent question of how are students able to respond in a different way when exploring the use of interactive read-alouds. But before we even dive into my research, it's important to really understand what makes a read-aloud interactive. So simply reading a book aloud does not make an interactive read-aloud. Instead, you really need to be selective and purposeful in the book that you choose and the focus that you want your IRA to have long term. You'll also need to practice reading the book aloud prior to reading it in front of your students because you are wanting to model to them what effective oral reading looks like. You'll want to pre-plan and select specific vocabulary and actions within the book that you want to highlight. And then the most important is you need to plan ahead. So in order to have a purposeful and effective interactive read aloud, you need to plan for stopping points to really guide discussion and ask questions. A lot of teachers prefer to use sticky notes in the book to help remind them to foster that conversation and pose that question. And of course, the whole time you're going to want to be modeling effective reading and fluency strategies to support our various learners and English language learners as well. So with that in mind, let's dive into my purpose and context for my research. So within my study, all the students that participated were receiving special education services within their literacy instruction block in the SPED resource room. So it was through a pull-out instruction. I was working with 5 fourth grade students and 1 fifth grade student, and their need for assessment became present through their IEP goals, but also through their developmental reading assessments that I took, or DRAs. And those took formal reading scores, which showed that all the students were up to 2 grade levels below in their reading achievement, which obviously told me, okay, something in their instruction needs to be changed. So let's start by interactive read-alouds. And I began to create my action research with the purpose of really understanding the ways in which interactive read-alouds could affect literacy achievement and engagement for students receiving special education services. Now for my study, literacy achievement was classified as both the reading fluency that they had, but also their comprehension levels. And then the literacy engagement was classified as reading attitudes and willingness to participate in those actual literary conversations that we were having as a group. Now my research was grounded in Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences because interactive read-alouds really serve to promote learning through various preferences and styles. So auditory processing by reading the book aloud, visual because the book was a picture book, kinesthetic because they're getting to feel the book, they're getting to do activities surrounding the book. So all of those things really grounded my theory of why interactive read-alouds would be a great implementation. And additionally, Vygotsky's theory of social constructivism provided a framework for my research as it discussed the importance of learning collaboratively and conversationally. And honestly, those two ideas are at the heart of what an interactive read-aloud is. You're creating knowledge about this text together. Throughout the rest of the literature that I reviewed, the benefits on literal and inferential comprehension and engagement were definitely seen through multiple studies because the educator is able to actually scaffold and model that effective thinking and reading and then provide that safe space for students to practice with those skills. And while achievement benefits using IRAs were seen in literature surrounding specific educational contexts, such as with a student that has high functioning autism or a student with severe dyslexia. more research still needs to be done regarding the use of IRAs in a generalizable sense for SPED because, like in my setting, we have students with multiple different classifications that are all coming to our resource room to receive instruction together. And so we really want to know how it looks in that more generalizable SPED setting. And as I began to consider how I would take this knowledge from all the research that I had looked at into my own research, I was really struck by this quote on the screen, that using read-alouds in small group settings could effectively manage instructional obstacles posed by those complex texts that we're asking our readers to navigate that sometimes they just need a little extra help with. So with all this research that I had done about interactive read-alouds in mind, here is my action plan. So I worked with a small group of 6 students over 4 weeks, and my first thing that I did with the students was give them all DRAs. Because I really wanted to get a baseline of their achievement levels prior to any implementation of the interactive read-alouds. And I also had students answer reading attitude questions, and then I transcribed their answers into a Google form. And these questions were adopted from the DRA continuum that the school site uses. Also, it's important to note that each IRA session was planned out with discussion questions, stopping points, sticky notes, all of that before any of the implementation started, just so that I could make sure that I had an end goal and focus for each interactive read aloud, but also the whole book as a whole. And I used different strategies from literature that I had reviewed on how to effectively plan out interactive read-alouds. So then the next part of my plan was the actual implementation of my IRAs. So there were 2 sessions a week, one on Tuesday, one on Thursday, and then we had an extension writing activity on Fridays. And those extension activities provided students a different way to show comprehension and engagement with the text, as they were given independent writing time to respond to various prompts. Now, the initial plan was that I would do a reflection activity and another round of DRAs at the end of our text, but this was not able to happen due to COVID school closures. So instead I used their extension activity work samples to really see if they were showing comprehension levels different than their initial DRAs. And throughout all of this, I was asking them reading attitude questions each week. Now, these questions really served to see their reading attitude outside of the classroom setting. So the questions were, what was the last book you finished reading, and what book are you currently reading? So to see, are they reading at their instructional level? What types of text do they like? Those type of interests. We then went into, do you enjoy reading? How often do you read, and do you ever read for fun? So really trying to get a sense of who they were as readers, and those questions were asked each week. Now, I did take both quantitative and qualitative data, but let's start with the quantitative. So during the 4 weeks of implementation, quantitative data was taken through counting the frequency of responses per theme or question that was asked throughout the interactive read-aloud. So when I'd listen back to the audio recordings of the interactive read-alouds, I would tally mark each time a student responded during a question that was posed or a theme that was being talked about. So on this top graph, that's where we see the quantitative data involving the percentage of individual responses in comparison to the total responses within the session. So students' responses were tallied for each time they spoke in the group, regardless of the content of their responses. So anytime that they said something that the whole group could hear during a specific theme or question, their response was counted, whether it was a repeat answer, something that maybe was off task, they were still all counted as a way of showing that they were at least engaging in the instruction at that point. And then we looked at their percentages. So the students' percentages of responses remained very similar throughout the research, as I saw that students who were more naturally extroverted in other school settings, such as student A and student T, were the ones that were ready to jump right in, answer questions first, and we see that through their regular ability to be one of the most frequently responding students. And then on the other side, we do see that Students who were more quiet and introverted in other school settings tended to be the ones that waited to respond until there was a clear lull in the conversation where they felt like they could jump in and wouldn't be interrupted or competing for airtime. Now there were ranges seen in their responses, as seen with like student C and student A, but I want to make note that these ranges in their average response times were typically seen because of the amount of students in the session. So when there were less students in the session, student C, for example, who was typically quieter, didn't have to try to fight for that airtime or wonder if it was his time to talk. Instead, he just was able to go for it and talk a little more frequently because there were less people he was competing with. But I want to look at the second graph a little bit because I found that the types of questions and themes that the students were responding to showed more relevant ways that they were willing to even engage with the text topics itself. So this bottom table shows the total student responses per theme within each IRA. These themes were created based upon the questions that I'd planned and asked students throughout the read-alouds, and I pulled similar themes and questions that were seen across the majority of the sessions. And within these themes, students were definitely excited to discuss the hot topics within the book, things that had a lot of information from the book that they could pull from, such as character actions, bullying, symbolism, right? There were a lot of things in the book that related to those, and so I felt like they were able to talk more extensively about it. And it was easier to remember knowledge when it was talked about more in the book. But then on the flip side, I did see that students became a little less likely to dive deeper into the topics that involved some inferencing that weren't explicitly stated in the book, but were there, such as setting changes, poverty, and empathy. Now, these numbers helped a lot when looking at trends, but I wanted to flip over to qualitative data because I did analyze the audio recordings for important remarks and conversations that happened as well. In addition, I also used their student work samples and their reading attitude questions for additional qualitative data. So when first looking at the findings, let's start on the left side with the reading attitude questions. So I found that a lot of the students, 5 of the 6 students actually, remained very consistent with their responses, especially to this question, do you enjoy reading? If they started with a yes, they ended with a yes. If they started with maybe, they typically ended with that in their final questioning. But one of my students, student C, did go from saying not much the first time that he was asked, do you enjoy reading, to kind of in the last one. And while this is just a small victory, I did want to make note of it because it is so important to realize those small victories, especially in short time frames. But let's jump over to the right-hand side. Excited remarks involving curiosity surrounding the book were very apparent in every session. I had students going, oh my gosh, are we going to read this page today? Is it the last page? I wonder what happens next. All of these like really excited, engaging remarks about the text before we even started the session each day. But something I like to call aha or light bulb moments happened at least once for each student. And those are seen just a few of them in those quotes on the right hand side. But students were really able to think deeply and make new connections with the help of my pre-planning to provide kind of balance of allowing the students to lead the conversation with their new insights, but also modeling that critical thinking and inferencing skills back to the text when it was needed for students. But in addition to all of those mind-blown moments, as student C would say, I do want to look at next steps because this research only had phase 1 due to timing. So when looking at the themes that students responded to, I wanted to look at those themes that they were least likely to really elaborate on. And those were seen with relation to text to self and text to world questions. So every interactive read aloud session, I ended the session with the same question. How does the book make you feel as the reader, as the audience member? How are you feeling? Those gut reactions that you feel from the text. And every single time, the students would go, oh, well, the characters must feel really sad. Or um, she probably is regretting what she did. And so it was that modeling and scaffolding of, okay, let's dig a little deeper, but how does that make you feel? If the character feels this way, how do you feel? So really relating it back to the student themselves and recognizing the personal reactions that they can have to reading. But additionally, I think it's always so important for students to keep practicing those collaborative conversation skills, those skills of taking turns, thinking before you speak, making sure that what you're going to say is adding to the conversation rather than distracting from it, or making sure that it hasn't already been said, that you're sharing that airtime. So I think that focusing on these type of skills will really aid in evening out the ability for students to respond in easier ways and feel a little more likely to jump in and respond. Um, so with all of this in mind, I did come across some findings and conclusions. And for me, I felt that students were really able to respond in new ways through the IRA sessions because they were allowed a flexibility that they didn't have in other literature settings. So while I did pose questions and I planned critical stopping points for them to think, I did not answer the questions. And so they were able to really use my question as a starting point and then navigate through conversations with their small group peers to come to new insights on their own, some that I didn't even consider being part of the IRA. So that was really exciting to see them really stepping up and being excited about that flexibility. They were so excited for the new structure, and I really saw that through the ability for them to actually have those aha meaning making moments where they were able to get to that conclusion on their own without a teacher going, well, wait, I think it's actually like this, but really just using me as a facilitator and letting them have the floor to discuss their ideas. So allowing for that student-led conversation, though, does require flexibility within the lesson plan to some degree. So you want to make sure that you're planning critical thinking questions and stopping points so that you can make sure to take advantage of those key points in the reading that you want your students to get something from. But you also need to make sure to plan in a balance of time for students to go with the flow and come to their own conclusions and ideas that may be very different than what you had initially thought they'd get out of the book. So as we think about my research study as a whole, there were definitely external limitations during this time. One of the biggest and most common being COVID-19 school closures, because I was going to be doing a 6-week implementation and instead it was only 4 weeks. However, something I want to talk about a little bit more was absenteeism of my students, because it really affected the timeline and the students' abilities to follow along with the read-alouds when they were absent. So one of my students, the 5th grade student R, he was actually only able to attend 1 of the 7 interactive read aloud sessions and 0 of the extension activities. This was due to his own absence, but also scheduling factors with his general education teacher. And that's something to note, is that all of these students were coming from different different general education classrooms to one special education resource center. So each classroom had different extracurricular activities each day, different PE times, different music times. And so that really was something that I needed to navigate through. But it was exciting that I did have 3 of the 6 students attend all 10 of the sessions, so all 7 IRAs and all 3 extension activities. However, that was a limitation, not having the other 3 there as regularly, because it did mean that we needed to kind of catch them up when they'd come back to see what meaning-making moments had happened for the other students in the last session. But as I reflect inward, my biggest internal limitation was seen in this being my very first time implementing action research and having to collect and analyze data in this way. And so I definitely think that there's room for me to grow, but I'm happy with this experience and the opportunity I've had to really learn how to research and implement different pedagogy styles that I am interested in. And of course, this is an action research study, so I did have a very small group size, and my group was very specific to my school site context, and so it unfortunately is not generalizable. However, just because I can't tell you with certainty that interactive read alouds are not going to work or are going to work with your set of students, It is always important for educators to continue considering ways to really reinvent your lessons or content to try to serve varying learning styles. So I just encourage all educators to try something new out in your literacy instruction and see how it goes. And that just really leads me into my reflection. So, honestly, seeing the joy and excitement that my students had each day as they entered the classroom for my small group brought me so much happiness because I was able to see them having this passion and excitement for literacy within the group that they weren't yet able to have in their own independent reading. And so I was hoping that as we kept going, it would begin to translate into reading outside of just our group setting. And the ability to collaborate with my colleagues and peers surrounding scheduling, my results, the needs of everyone involved. Because when you are working with special education students, they also have a general education teacher. They have maybe other resources going on, maybe OT, counseling, whatever is going on, those people need their hours too. And so it was definitely a time for me to learn how to express my own needs while also balancing others' needs and trying to find the best outcome for all of us involved as we're trying to serve our students. But if nothing else, this semester really has taught me to roll with the punches, from students not showing up to the groups or emergency fire drills happening mid-sentence of reading or COVID-19. I've really had to learn to be flexible, and I've had to learn to respond with grace as I am a role model for my students, and they are looking up to me to see what's going on and how to respond to things themselves. So as I look forward to my own teaching career, I am so excited to continue to implement interactive read-alouds into my classroom. I feel like I've just scratched the surface with them, and there's so much more to learn about how students react to them with other stories. So I read Each Kindness by Jacqueline Woodson with my small group, and that is a picture book fiction text that relates to bullying and socioeconomic status topics. So that's one specific focus for an IRA. There's so many more books and focuses that I could have done, and so I'm looking forward to seeing how students respond to different types of interactive read-alouds. And lastly, I would really just like to thank everyone who has supported me throughout my Master's of Education this year, my critical friends who have edited my paper for me, Dr. Michelle, who has helped me through my entire research process, my cooperating teachers who helped me in the classroom, and of course my students who made it all possible. Thank you so much for the support throughout the semester, and I hope you've just learned a little bit about what it takes to do an interactive read aloud and maybe been inspired and encouraged to try something new with your own students. And here are my references. If you'd like to know more, please go ahead and comment or reach out to me, and I'd love to talk to you about my research or send you my research papers. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.